The office was quieter than usual. The distant hum of computers and the occasional shuffle of papers were the only sounds as the rest of the team had trickled out for the day. The glow of the city lights seeped into the sleek conference room, reflecting off its polished surfaces. I glanced at the time, 7:45 p.m., and then at Victor Sinclair, seated at the head of the table, his sharp eyes scanning through a document with practiced precision. Victor was a legend in the industry. At 70, he exuded a commanding presence that made everyone in the room sit a little straighter. His silver hair, neatly combed back, and the faint lines on his face told stories of decades spent building empires. But what drew people in wasn't just his reputation. It was the quiet intensity in his gaze, the way he spoke, as if every word carried the weight of experience. "You don't have to stay late, Alexis," he said without looking up. His voice was deep, tinged with weariness, yet firm. "I can finish this on my own." "It's no trouble," I replied, adjusting the papers in front of me. "Besides, I'd rather not leave work unfinished." Victor glanced at me then, a fleeting smile softening the hard lines of his face. "That's what I admire about you." His words lingered longer than they should have. I felt a flush creep up my neck and quickly busied myself with my notes. But my hands betrayed me, trembling ever so slightly. For months, I'd told myself that my admiration for Victor was purely professional, yet there were moments. Glances held a second too long, conversations that veered into personal territory, that made me question whether he felt it too. "Do you ever regret it?" His question broke the silence, his eyes fixed on the rain streaking down the large window behind me. "Regret what?" I asked, unsure of where this was going. "Chasing ambition, sacrificing other things for success." The question caught me off guard. Victor wasn't one to share personal musings, especially not with someone as junior as me. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice softer than I intended. "But I think it's worth it, isn't it?" Victor leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. I used to think so too. There was something in his tone, regret perhaps. It added a layer of vulnerability to the man I thought was unshakable. I wanted to ask more, to unravel the thoughts behind those words, but I hesitated, unsure of where the line between professionalism and something else was drawn. The rain outside grew heavier, the rhythmic tapping against the glass, filling the silence between us. Victor's gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable. For the first time, I felt the weight of the space between us, not just the physical distance, but the years, the unspoken boundaries, the unacknowledged emotions. "Alexis," he began, his voice quieter now, "there's something I need to say." My heart raced as I waited for his next words, the atmosphere in the room growing heavier with every passing second. The air in the conference room felt charged, every small movement amplified in the silence. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped in front of him. His piercing gaze held mine, and I could feel the weight of whatever he was about to say. "You remind me of someone," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. It was a tone I'd never heard from him before. "Someone I knew a long time ago." I didn't trust myself to speak, so I nodded, urging him to continue. She was ambitious, like you, driven to prove herself, to achieve more than anyone thought possible. His lips curved into a faint, almost wistful smile. "She was extraordinary." I felt a twinge of jealousy at his words, though I didn't fully understand why. "What happened to her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor's expression darkened. He looked away, his gaze drifting back to the rain-streaked windows. "She made sacrifices. Too many, perhaps. In the end, she realized she'd given up more than she gained." There was a vulnerability in his words that made my chest ache. I wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but I held back. Instead, I said, "Do you think she regrets it?" Victor turned back to me, his eyes searching mine. "I think she wonders what might have been if she'd chosen differently, if she'd let herself feel more, risk more." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. I shifted in my seat, my fingers fidgeting with the edge of the notebook in front of me. "It sounds like she wasn't the only one who made sacrifices," I ventured, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions building inside me. Victor's lips twitched into a rueful smile. "You're perceptive, Alexis, more than most." He stood then, walking to the window, his hands in his pockets. His silhouette against the city lights was imposing, yet strangely vulnerable. I watched him, torn between the urge to ask more and the fear of overstepping. "Do you ever wonder, Alexis," he said without turning around, "what it would be like to choose differently, to put aside the expectations, the rules, and just act on what you feel?" The question hit me like a physical blow. My pulse quickened, my breath hitching in my throat. Was he talking about himself? About us? The unspoken connection that had been simmering between us for months? I hesitated, my voice faltering. "I think, we all wonder about that sometimes." Victor turned then, his gaze intense, his expression unreadable. "And what stops you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. I felt my throat tighten, my thoughts racing. What was stopping me? Fear? Doubt? The weight of everything unspoken between us? I don't know, I admitted finally, my voice trembling. Victor stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking. His presence was overwhelming, the air around him almost magnetic. "Maybe," he said softly, "it's time to stop wondering." My heart pounded as he took another step closer, his gaze never leaving mine. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to think. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us in the dimly lit conference room. Victor reached out, his hand brushing against mine, a tentative, almost hesitant touch that sent a shiver down my spine. "Alexis," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "tell me to stop." I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, my body betraying the internal war raging inside me. "Victor," I murmured, my voice trembling. He stepped even closer, his hand sliding up to cup my face. His touch was warm, steady, and it sent a jolt of electricity through me. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "But if you don't want this, if you don't want me, tell me now." My breath hitched, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. I searched his eyes, looking for hesitation, for doubt, but all I saw was raw, unfiltered emotion. "I don't want you to stop," I whispered. The words were barely out of my mouth before he closed the distance between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both hesitant and overwhelming. It was as if all the tension, all the unspoken words between us had finally found release. His hands slid into my hair, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, and I found myself responding with equal fervor. The world outside ceased to exist. It was just us, Victor and me, caught in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. His lips moved against mine with a tenderness that made my heart ache, and I felt myself melting into him, my hands gripping his shirt as if to anchor myself. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. This changes everything," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. I nodded, my hands still clutching his shirt. "I know," I said softly, "but I don't care." Victor's lips brushed mine again, softer this time, a promise in the way he held me. "Neither do I," he said, his voice barely audible. Victor's words hung in the air, charged with a gravity that made my knees weak. The warmth of his breath lingered on my lips, and for a moment, all the noise in my mind quieted. It was just him, his eyes searching mine, his hands steady against me, his presence filling the room. I hadn't realized until then how much space he occupied in my thoughts, my life. "This isn't," I began, my voice faltering under the weight of the moment. "This isn't what I expected." Victor's lips curved into a faint smile, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. "It's not what I expected either," he admitted, his voice deep and raw. "But some things, Alexis, they're not meant to be planned." The way he said my name sent a shiver through me. It wasn't just the sound of it. It was the way he spoke, as if I were the only person in the world who mattered. His fingers trailed down my cheek, resting briefly against my jawline, before his hand fell away, leaving behind a warmth that lingered long after his touch was gone. I couldn't bring myself to step back, to put distance between us. Instead, I stayed rooted in place, the magnetic pull between us growing stronger with every passing second. "Victor," I said, my voice trembling with the mix of emotion swirling inside me. "What happens now?" He took a step back, breaking the physical connection, but keeping his gaze locked on mine. The intensity in his eyes softened slightly, replaced by something gentler, almost protective. "We don't rush this," he said firmly. "We don't let it ruin what we've built, but we also don't ignore it." My breath caught in my throat. He made it sound so simple, so reasonable. Yet the part of me that thrived on structure, on logic, was screaming at me that this was anything but. Still, I couldn't deny the truth in his words, or the pull I felt toward him. Before I could respond, he turned and walked to the large windows overlooking the city. His hands were in his pockets, his broad shoulders framed by the dim light from the rain-soaked skyline. "I've spent my life making decisions," he said quietly. "Big ones, life-changing ones. But this feels different." I watched him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "How so?" I asked, stepping closer. He glanced over his shoulder at me, his expression unreadable. "Because it's not just about me. It's about you. And what you deserve." The weight of his words hit me like a tidal wave. It wasn't just about what he wanted. It was about what he thought was right for me. The thought was both humbling and terrifying. "You don't get to decide that," I said softly, but there was steel in my voice. "What I deserve is for us to be honest about this, about what we feel." Victor turned fully, his hands still in his pockets, his jaw tight as he studied me. "And what do you feel, Alexis?" The question was direct, cutting through the haze of doubt and fear that clouded my thoughts. I didn't know how to answer, not fully, but I knew I had to try. I feel like you see me, like no one else has," I said, my voice trembling. "And it terrifies me, but it also makes me want to be here, with you." His expression softened, and for the first time I saw the hint of relief in his eyes. He stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking once again. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear that," he murmured. The tension in the room was palpable, but it had shifted. It wasn't just about the unspoken connection between us. It was about what we were willing to risk to explore it. And in that moment, I knew There was no turning back. Victor reached for my hand, his touch firm yet gentle. "If we do this," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "we do it on our terms. No games, no pretending, just honesty." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. His hand tightened around mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. "Okay," I managed to whisper. He smiled then, a real, genuine smile that lit up his face and made my heart ache in the best way. "Okay," he repeated, as if solidifying the moment. We stood there, the city lights casting a faint glow around us, the rain outside softening to a steady patter. It felt like the world had paused, waiting for us to take the next step. And when Victor leaned down to kiss me again, it was as if everything else faded away. This kiss was different, less hesitant, more certain. His hands cradled my face, his touch grounding me as his lips moved against mine with a deliberate intensity that made my knees weak. I clung to him, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as I lost myself in the sensation. The world outside the conference room ceased to exist. It was just us, two people caught in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. And as his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, I knew that this was the beginning of something neither of us could walk away from. We broke apart slowly, our breaths mingling in the stillness of the room. Victor rested his forehead against mine, his hands still cradling my face. "I don't want to stop," he said softly, his voice raw with emotion. "Then don't," I whispered, my own voice trembling with the weight of what we were about to step into. Victor smiled, his thumb brushing against my cheek in a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. "You're incredible," he murmured. "Don't ever doubt that." His words settled deep within me, a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the physical connection we shared. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about attraction or tension. It was about trust, about two people finding something real in a world that so often felt anything but. As the rain continued to fall outside, we stayed there, wrapped in the fragile beginnings of something new, something we both knew would change everything. The air between us was thick with unspoken emotion, the kind that felt too big for words but too real to ignore. Victor's hands lingered on my face, his touch both grounding and electrifying, as if he were afraid to let go. His eyes searched mine, as though he was looking for something. Permission, perhaps, or reassurance. I wasn't sure which of us needed it more. "I never thought I'd feel this again," he admitted, his voice rough, almost a whisper. "I'd convinced myself that part of my life was over." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Why?" The question came out softer than I intended, but the curiosity was real. How could someone like him, strong, magnetic, endlessly self-assured, believe that he wasn't capable of this kind of connection? Victor's thumb brushed against my cheek, a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. Because when you've lived as long as I have, you start to believe the best parts of life are behind you, that you've already had your chance. He paused, his eyes darkening. And then you came along. The weight of his confession settled over me, heavy and warm. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to reconcile the vulnerability in his voice with the man I'd always seen as unshakable. But I knew one thing with startling clarity. I didn't want to let him go. "Victor," I began, my voice trembling. "You deserve more than just looking back at what was. You deserve to feel everything." Now, he let out a soft, almost disbelieving laugh, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting mine again. "You make it sound so simple." Maybe it is, I said, surprising even myself with the conviction in my voice. Maybe we overcomplicate things because we're afraid of what happens if we don't. Victor studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he stepped back. The sudden loss of his warmth, like a physical ache. You don't understand what this would mean, he said, his tone measured but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps? Or doubt? Not just for me, for you. I felt the sting of his words, but I refused to back down. Then help me understand, I said firmly. Don't push me away because you think you're protecting me. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. The silence stretched between us, the rain outside the only sound. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. It's not that simple, Alexis. There are consequences. To this, to us. When you say this to me, the sand lifting from my eyes. I know, I said softly, stepping closer, but I also know that we don't get to choose when something real comes into our lives. And this, it's real, Victor. His eyes closed briefly, as if he were trying to collect himself. When he opened them again, they were filled with an intensity that made my breath catch. You have no idea how much I want to believe that, he said, his voice low and strained. Then believe it, I whispered. Because I do. The words hung in the air between us, fragile, yet unshakable. I could see the war in his eyes, the push and pull of emotions he was trying so hard to contain. And then, as if something inside him finally broke, he reached for me again. This time, there was no hesitation. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me flush against him as his lips found mine. The kiss was deeper, more urgent, as though he were pouring everything he couldn't say into that single act. I responded with equal fervor, my arms wrapping around his neck, my fingers tangling in his hair. The world around us disappeared, the steady patter of rain, the distant hum of the city. All of it faded into the background. All I could feel was him, the strength of his arms, the warmth of his body, the way his lips moved against mine, like he was afraid this moment might slip away if he didn't hold on to it tightly enough. We stumbled backward, his hands steadying me as the edge of the conference table pressed against the back of my thighs. His lips trailed from my mouth to my jawline, then down to the sensitive curve of my neck, leaving a trail of heat in their wake. My breath hitched, my fingers tightening against his shoulders as I fought to keep my balance, not just physically but emotionally. Every touch, every kiss, was pulling me deeper into something I knew I could never come back from. Alexis, he murmured against my skin, his voice a mix of desire and restraint. Tell me to stop. I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I tilted my head back, giving him silent permission to continue. His lips returned to mine, more insistent now, as his hands moved to my hips, lifting me onto the table with an ease that made my pulse race. My legs instinctively wrapped around him, pulling him closer, and I felt his breath hitch against my lips. The room felt impossibly warm, the tension between us crackling like electricity. Every touch, every movement felt like a spark igniting something long dormant inside me. It wasn't just desire, it was need, raw and unfiltered, and it consumed us both. Victor's hands moved with a confidence that belied his earlier hesitation, sliding up my sides, his fingers tracing the curve of my waist. I clung to him, my own hands exploring the broad expanse of his shoulders, the strong line of his back. It was as though we were trying to memorize each other, to etch this moment into our very being. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, We were both breathless. His hands framed my face, his thumbs brushing against my cheeks as he searched my eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," I said, without hesitation, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "I've never been more sure of anything." Something shifted in his expression, a mix of relief and determination. He kissed me again, slower this time, as if savoring every second. His hands moved to my thighs, his touch firm, yet reverent, and I felt a heat spread through me that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The rain outside intensified, the sound filling the room like a rhythm only we could hear. Time seemed to blur, each moment bleeding into the next as we lost ourselves in each other. There was no space for doubt, no room for hesitation. It was just us, two people crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But neither of us cared. Victor's hand steadied me as the intensity between us reached its peak, a moment where every thought, every worry, and every fear melted away, leaving only the raw connection we had fought so hard to suppress. The rain outside blurred the city lights into streaks of gold and silver, casting a dim glow across the room. But it was his gaze that held me captive. "Alexis," he murmured, his voice trembling with an emotion I couldn't quite name. His hands lingered on my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin in a gesture so tender it sent a shiver through me. "You have no idea how much this means to me." I could only nod, my throat tight with the weight of the moment. Words felt inadequate, too small to capture the magnitude of what we were stepping into. Instead, I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against his, letting the silence between us say everything. For a long time we stayed like that, wrapped in the fragile stillness of what we had just shared. His fingers traced lazy patterns along my arm, grounding me even as my thoughts spun with the enormity of what this meant for him, for me, for us. And yet, in the quiet warmth of his presence, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Hope. Victor broke the silence first, his voice low and steady. "This changes everything," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken earlier. But this time, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only certainty. I pulled back slightly, enough to meet his gaze. "I know," I said softly. "But maybe that's not a bad thing." He smiled then, a rare, genuine smile that softened the hard lines of his face and made my chest ache with an almost unbearable tenderness. "You're extraordinary, Alexis," he said, his tone reverent. "And if I'm being honest, I've known that from the moment you walked into my office." His confession took my breath away. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to process the magnitude of his words. "Victor, I, I mean it," he interrupted gently, his hands cradling my face as if I were something precious. "You've reminded me of what it means to feel alive again, to take risks, to hope." Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Instead, I reached up, placing my hands over his, anchoring us in the moment. "You've done the same for me," I whispered. We sat there for a while longer, the rain outside softening to a gentle patter, the hum of the city below a distant murmur. There was something profoundly comforting about the stillness, as if the universe had paused just for us, giving us the time and space to exist in this fragile, perfect moment. Eventually, Victor spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "We have to be careful," he said, his tone tinged with the weight of reality. "This isn't going to be easy." "I know," I replied, my fingers curling around his. "What? I don't want to pretend this didn't happen," I don't want to go back to pretending we don't feel this." His expression softened, and he leaned forward, pressing a lingering kiss to my forehead. "Neither do I," he said. "But I need you to promise me something." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what happens, you won't lose yourself in this. In me," he said, his gaze steady and earnest. "You're too brilliant, too important to let this, us, overshadow everything else you're meant to do." Satisfied, Victor kissed me again, a slow, deliberate kiss that felt like both a beginning and a promise. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his hand still holding me close. "We'll figure this out," he said softly, "together." And in that moment, I believed him. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions: exhilaration, fear, uncertainty, but beneath it all was a steady undercurrent of something stronger: trust. Victor and I navigated the uncharted territory of our new dynamic with cautious optimism, careful to protect the connection we had forged, while remaining mindful of the challenges we would undoubtedly face. There were stolen glances across the boardroom, fleeting touches that spoke volumes, and quiet moments where we allowed ourselves to simply exist in each other's presence. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was real, and that was enough. As time passed, I found myself growing more certain of what we had, even as the world around us remained blissfully unaware. Victor, too, seemed to thrive in the newfound intimacy we shared, his once guarded demeanor softening in ways that surprised even him. But perhaps the most surprising thing of all was the way this unexpected connection began to shape not just our lives, but our perspectives. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, truly valued, not just for what I brought to the table professionally, but for who I was at my core. And Victor, he rediscovered a part of himself he thought he'd lost forever, a part that allowed him to dream again. In the end, our story wasn't about breaking rules or defying expectations. It was about finding something unexpected in the most unlikely of places. It was about two people taking a chance on something fragile and imperfect, knowing full well that it might not last, but choosing to embrace it anyway. And as we stood together one evening, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky, I realized that no matter what the future held, we had already won, because we had dared to feel, to risk, to hope. And that, I knew, was a victory worth holding on to.